Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a really powerful entity, almost like the central conductor of this huge global economic orchestra. And they make a move, a decision that some experts are now calling like a huge mistake,
Hmm.
one with potentially dire consequences for the whole economy. That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is the Federal Reserve's latest decision. They've kept interest rates unchanged. Again, for the fourth meeting in a row.
Yeah.
And our source material for this deep dive, it's this sharp expert analysis arguing, like, this isn't just a little misstep. It's a terrible move. It could really impact the U.S. economy and potentially, your job, your finances.
Right. So we're going to take a close look at the data behind this, maybe challenge some assumptions people have, and try to understand why this decision is causing such a stir. Our mission, really, is to pull out the key insights from this analysis, make these kind of complex economic arguments clear and relevant to you. So the first big point the source makes is that despite what you might be hearing, the economy, if you look objectively at the numbers, it's actually extremely weak.
Mm.
Even if we're not, technically in what the NDER calls a recession, the picture, not healthy.
It's a pretty stark contrast, isn't it, to this sort of general feeling sometimes. So let's look at retail sales, for example. The trend there has been basically down since July 2024. We've had several negative months. May 2025, for instance, it saw a 0.9% drop. The expectation was only like minus 0.3%.
Wow, it's quite a miss.
It is. And what's really important to get here is that this is the nominal number.
Meaning not adjusted for inflation?
Exactly. It's not inflation adjusted. So when you actually factor inflation in, real retail sales, they've been negative for over a year now. And, consumption is, what, 70% of the U.S. economy?
Yeah, the vast majority.
So that is, frankly, a huge red flag.
And it's not just about what people are buying, right? Are we seeing this weakness pop up in other areas too?
Oh, absolutely. Take the ISM services data that measures activity in the services sector, restaurants, healthcare, things like that. It just dipped below 50.
And below 50 usually means?
Contraction, or at least significant economic weakness. It's a standard benchmark. And think about something really relatable like restaurant data. It's plummeting. And that's often an early warning sign, right? Because eating out is usually one of the first things people cut back on when money gets tight. Even airlines, they're reporting what they call recession-like conditions. Domestic flights, overall demand, it's down. They're making profits mostly because fuel costs have come down a lot, not because people are flying more.
Okay, so the demand side is weak.
Very much so.
But, okay, I can already hear my friend, let's call him Fred, saying, hold on, what are you guys talking about? The labor market's amazing. Unemployment's only 4.2%. What does our source say about that? Because that's the number everyone quotes.
Yeah, Fred's point is a really common one, but it's maybe a bit surface level. It's true. The non-farm payroll numbers, the headline job number, it's been positive. But the expectations for those numbers, they were incredibly low. So beating those low expectations by just a few thousand jobs, well, it doesn't exactly signal a booming economy.
Right. Context matters.
Hugely. And more importantly, look at other job market data points. The ADP numbers. They plummeted in the last report. And the household survey. Now, that's different. It polls individual households, not businesses like the payroll survey.
Okay.
That household survey showed contraction. Almost 700,000 jobs lost last month.
700,000 lost. That's massive compared to the payroll game.
That's a huge discrepancy, and it points to underlying weakness.
So if the household survey says nearly 700,000 jobs vanished, why is the main unemployment rate still so low at 4.2%?
That's the catch. It's largely because the labor force participation rate has dropped quite a bit.
Meaning fewer people are actually looking for work.
Exactly. When people stop looking for work, maybe they retire early, go back to school, or just get discouraged, they're no longer counted as unemployed. It makes the unemployment rate look artificially low. Our source actually estimates that if you adjust for this falling participation, the real unemployment rate be closer to 5%, and probably heading higher.
Okay.
So when you connect that back to your financial well-being, this mix of weakening consumer spending and a, let's say, nuanced job market, it paints a much less rosy picture than just the headline unemployment rate suggests. It means tighter budgets and maybe tougher job prospects could be a real thing for a lot of people.
Okay, so we have this pretty compelling picture of a weakening economy on one side. But on the other side, the Fed's main reason for keeping rates high is usually inflation, right? Our source apparently has some surprising things to say here, too. Suggests inflation isn't the beast it was.
That's right. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because the recent inflation data, whether you look at the main CPI, the Consumer Price Index, or core CPI, which strips out volatile food and energy, or even the PPI, the Producer Price Index. All of them have consistently been coming in under expectation.
Under expectations, consistently.
Which really pushes back against the idea that inflation is still, spiraling or accelerating. We are seeing a very clear trend of disinflation. Prices are still rising, but at a much slower rate. That sort of tidal wave of inflation that some people worried about from, say, tariffs, it just hasn't happened.
Okay.
And remember, the Fed's target is 2% inflation. Right now, we're hovering around, 2.3%, maybe 2.4%. We're not miles away from the target. And crucially, the trend is clearly downwards.
That definitely puts the Fed's decision to hold rates steady in a different light. How does the U.S. Fed's position compare to what other major central banks are doing right now?
That's a really important point. Because when you look internationally, the Fed looks like an outlier. The European Central Bank, the ECB, their rate is at 2%.
Yeah.
The Bank of Canada, they've already cut rates down to 2.75%. And that's particularly interesting because Canada's unemployment rate is up around 7%.
Wow, 7% unemployment and they're cutting rates.
Exactly. So you've got these other major developed economies. They're seeing similar trends, maybe even weaker ones, and they are cutting rates. Meanwhile, the U.S. Fed is holding steady at 4.3%. So you connect all this weak economy here, inflation trending down, it's going to have to scratch your head and ask, why wouldn't the Fed cut rates?
Okay, let's try and be charitable for a second. Give the Fed the benefit of the doubt. What's the argument for holding off? Is it maybe fear of new inflation, like you mentioned, tariffs, or maybe that recent spike in oil prices we saw? But this is where, according to our source, looking back at history gets really, really interesting.
Yes, exactly. And this is where history provides a pretty powerful counter-argument to that fear. Let's rewind to the 2007-2008 period. Just before and during the global financial crisis, remember oil prices back then? They went crazy, spiked from around $72 a barrel up to like $133 by mid-2008.
I remember that. Painful at the pump.
Totally. And at the exact same time, the economy was clearly weakening, getting worse month by month. But here's the crucial part. What was the Fed doing then? They were cutting interest rates. They started cutting in September 2007, even as oil was climbing.
Okay, so oil skyrockets, the economy's weak, the Fed's cutting rates. What happened to overall inflation? Did it just explode because of the oil prices?
No, quite the opposite, actually. I mean, yes, the headline CPI, it did tick up initially because of oil, went from about 3.5% up to maybe 5.6%. But the underlying weakness in the economy, the lack of broad demand, it quickly overwhelmed the oil price effect. We saw rapid disinflation. Within just 6 months of that oil peak, CPI fell off a cliff, plummeted all the way down to 0% as the financial crisis really hit.
0%. Wow.
Yeah, and this illustrates a key concept. Our source uses a really great analogy here. It's like robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Robbing Peter to pay Paul. Okay, how does that explain this? It sounds counterintuitive, right? Oil is an input for everything.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? If the price of oil, something used in almost everything, goes way up, how can overall prices not go up at the same crazy rate? Well, the robbing Peter to pay Paul idea links it back to the money supply and, importantly, wages. If the overall amount of money in the economy isn't increasing fast enough, and people's wages, nominal wages, aren't keeping up with those spiking oil prices.
Which they usually don't that quickly.
Right. Then you, the consumer, are forced into a tough spot. You have to buy gas to get to work, right? That becomes non-negotiable. So a bigger chunk of your paycheck goes to just filling the tank. Peter gets paid.
Okay.
But that means you have less money left over for Paul for other things, discretionary stuff, like going out to eat or buying that plane ticket for a trip. So you see demand, and therefore prices for those things start to fall. Restaurants, travel, non-essentials.
So some prices go up, but others go down because people just can't afford both.
Precisely. But it gets worse. Eventually, the high cost of the necessities, the Peter stuff, it impacts people so much they basically stop spending on almost anything else. Then those businesses selling the Paul stuff, they have to cut back. They lay off workers. Unemployment goes up. Overall demand in the economy drops sharply. And that's ultimately crushes inflation and leads to disinflation, even if oil prices stay high for a while.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. And what about the money supply right now? Is M2, that broad measure, growing? Is it providing fuel?
It's not at all. M2 money supply has actually been lower since April 2022. It's shrunk. So there's literally less fuel, less money chasing goods and services, which worked against inflation. People's overall purchasing power has gone down. That actively pushes towards disinflation.
Okay.
And, for anyone thinking, but what about the 1970s? stagflation.
Mm-hmm.
Our source points out that even during those periods of slow growth and high inflation, it was ultimately the recession, the spike in unemployment, that brought inflation down, not the other way around.
Got it.
So the historical lesson seems pretty clear. High input costs, like oil, in a weak economy with flat or shrinking money supply. That usually leads to recession and less inflation, not more runaway inflation.
Okay, so history suggests maybe the Fed's fear about oil restarting inflation might be misplaced given the weak economy. Now, let's broaden out. What about the Fed's overall track record with managing rates? How good are they at timing these things?
Well, the track record is revealing, let's put it that way. If you look at the data going back to, say, 1985, what people often call the modern Fed era, here's a striking fact.
Yeah.
Every single time the main Fed funds rate has crashed, meaning big, rapid cuts, it was preceded by a recession already starting or being very imminent. Every single time.
Preceded by recession, not the other way around.
Exactly, which leads to a crucial question our source asks. How many times has the Fed cut rates too early? As in, they cut aggressively and whoops, inflation came roaring back. The answer, according to this analysis, is 0 times.
0.
0 times. Every major cutting cycle led to disinflation and economic contraction or recession, not renewed inflation.
Okay, 0 times too early. What about the flip side? Have they ever cut too late?
Well, the source argues pretty forcefully.
Not always?
Always too late to cut, and often too late to hike as well, like we saw in 2021 and 2022 when inflation was taking off. If you chart it, the Fed funds rate basically just follows the 2-year Treasury yield.
The market rate.
Yeah, the market's expectation. But the Fed always follows it with a lag. They're reactive, not proactive, consistently behind the curve.
Now, my friend Fred, he's persistent. He might look back and find some instance where the Fed maybe tweaked rates down by a tiny bit, like 25 basis points, and say, see, they cut rates there and we didn't get a recession.
Yeah.
How does the source handle that kind of counterexample?
Yeah, that's a fair question Fred might ask. But the source argues that those small tweaks, like a quarter-point cut here or there, they probably didn't have a huge impact on the overall economy anyway, not enough to single-handedly prevent a recession that might have otherwise happened. And crucially, those small cuts usually didn't happen alongside the really strong recession indicators we see sometimes, like a deeply inverted yield curve.
Where long-term rates are lower than short-term rates.
Exactly. That inversion is a much stronger signal. So those small cuts without the inversion, probably more correlation than causation. And this whole discussion, it kind of raises a more fundamental question, which is, how much control does the Fed really have over the economy anyway? Our source uses another good metaphor here. Think of the economy as a really complex patient. And interest rates are like one specific type of medicine. The Fed, they're the doctor. They think they can control the patient's health just by adjusting the dosage of this one medicine, the overnight interest rate.
Okay, I follow.
But the source suggests, well, maybe the Fed controls the dosage of that one drug, the very short-term rate. But they don't really control the entire pharmacy. They don't control all the other interest rates across the board, especially the long-term ones, like the 10-year Treasury yield or the 30-year mortgage rate. And those long-term rates arguably have a much bigger, more direct impact on the economy's overall health. Think borrowing, investment.
Okay, so the Fed controls the little tap, but not the whole plumbing system, maybe. The rates are more a reflection of the patient's condition rather than the thing controlling the condition.
That's a great way to put it, yes. The rates are more like a symptom or a reflection of what's already happening inside the patient's body, the economy. They're not the sole determinant of the patient's health. So the conclusion from this perspective is, even if the Fed starts cutting rates now, it's probably not going to magically avoid the inevitable if underlying economic storm clouds are gathering. Sure, cutting might make things slightly better, maybe, cushion the fall a bit, but the Fed ultimately cannot control the business cycle. It's bigger than their policy levers.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what's the main takeaway for you listening right now? Our deep dive into this analysis suggests we have a Federal Reserve that, by keeping rates high right now, might be ignoring some pretty clear signs of a weakening economy and falling inflation. And this decision, the source argues, could actually be pushing us towards an economic downturn. And maybe even more fundamentally, their actual power to steer the economy might be a lot less than we, or maybe even they think. More reactive than proactive.
Exactly. And if knowledge is really most valuable when you can understand it and maybe apply it, then this whole discussion raises a really important, maybe provocative question for you to think about. If the Federal Reserve isn't truly the one driving the economic cycles, if they're mostly just responding to forces already in motion, then what does that imply about where you should be focusing your attention and maybe your preparations for whatever the economic future holds?
That is definitely something to chew on. Well, that's our deep dive for today. We really hope you found these insights as fascinating and maybe useful as we did. If you enjoyed it, please do make sure to follow, like, and hey, share the deep dive. It genuinely helps us get these conversations out to more curious minds, just like yours.
Yeah, please do. And for more content that tries to help you navigate these sometimes confusing economic waters, you can follow What Bitcoin Taught Me on Twitter, X, Nostr, Bluesky, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We're pretty much everywhere.